we have had a great experience here at CRISP for 2 days with a masterclass, and the topic for the masterclass was what's next for Agile. So could you maybe explore a bit why that's a current topic and what it really is next for Agile?
Yeah, I think it's been a great 2 days, right?
Yeah.
I think Agile is at a turning point at the moment, right? I think what you're actually starting to see is increasing commoditization.
Mm.
So you've got sort of, the safe Borg sitting there with a sort of everything encompassing. DevOps comes along, that gets incorporated. You've got the Scrum Alliance working with less. You're getting these very large mega method factories, with a heavy focus on accreditation. And that, to my mind, is commodifying what was originally something very different in terms of a movement, right? You've also got the big consultancies are now starting to recognize the revenue stream from Agile, so they're acquiring small Agile houses, and they'll do that for the next 6 months or so.
Mm.
And they're starting to use their account management teams to move into the same field. So I think one of the big issues on this now for small Agile companies, for people who still really think the Agile manifesto is what it was all about, is to create differentiated services, right? So there's still a whole bunch of work to do here. For example, new forms of software architecture, stuff we're working on, which we talked about this week, about unarticulated user needs, pre-Scrum techniques in Agile, i.e. developing the new novel things around the commodity suppliers, right? So that's one part of it. I think the other part is there's also a rather slavish belief that you can just take Agile methods and move them anywhere in the company. You see this in people like Steve Dennen and the like. And again, I think that's a failure to appreciate context. But I think the principles of Agile, which are very similar to the principles of complexity, and we spent all day on this yesterday, I was looking at new forms of organizational design, managing informal networks, recognizing that hierarchy has value. It can't always be thrown out, but it needs to be supplemented. Looking at ways in which we can create cross-silo knowledge collaboration, looking in ways in which, as I said earlier, we can deal with unarticulated needs, we can provide decision support to executives. Effectively scaling, not by aggregating Agile techniques into a construct, but by changing the way we interact with the C-suite.
Yeah, so I see Agile has been on the operational flow, and now trying to take those kind of methods and practices, just applying them across the company is not enough, or not working.
No, not enough, and it won't work, right? I mean, I think you can get some value, and we see that in marketing using a Scrum type technique, right? But I mean, Scrum in Cynefin terms, right, is a boundary transition technique between complex and complicated. The real value comes where you do things in the pure complex space, where things are very loose and very forming. So, to give an illustration, one of the points I've been making, which has upset a few people, is that Kanban is a complicated technique, not a complex technique. Now, if somebody pushes me on that, I qualify it and say, well, work in progress is a common concept to complex and complicated. But the way Kanban represents work in progress assumes discrete units, therefore it's complicated.
With some linear steps.
Whereas if we actually see work in progress as unrealized potentialities, then it's complex. But then we need a whole different way of representing the concept, which is something we do with narrative landscapes, for example. So I think the key now is to produce new, highly energy efficient, radical, high-value innovations around the core of what Agile has become, rather than try and compete with the Borg in the middle.
And you touched upon Cynefin now. You also updated it slightly. So what's new and why did
the big issue is to introduce what's called the liminal version of Cynefin, and I've also made it available for free for anybody with a PowerPoint and Keynote version. For a long time, we did a lot of work on boundary transitions, and that didn't necessarily get the point across as well as I wanted. And the liminality concept is a key concept in anthropology and elsewhere. It's a state of transition. It's a state of going one state to the other, but not truly knowing where you are. So effectively, I created 2 liminal divisions on Cynefin, which is easy to do with one stroke of a pen. That always makes it easier. So there's a liminal domain in complex of something about to become complicated. So that's where Scrum fits, for example, because it's a linear iteration, it's not a parallel iteration. It's starting to structure something. If it works, it will produce something which is repeatable, which can aggregate. So it's a liminal technique, and that's its huge value. We then create a liminal area into the chaos domain, which is an intrusion, a deliberate destruction of connectivity, a deliberate destruction of constraints for innovation or for wisdom of the crowds. So what the liminal version allows us to do is to basically define two more domains within Cynefin, makes it more sophisticated without confusing the original concept.
So both the liminal domain boarding to the chaos, where you actually have innovation and creativity, and then the second one boarding to between complex and complicated, where you actually can make complex more and pull them over to.
But it's within the complex domain, which is a principle. So it's legitimizing the statement that Scrum is a complex technique. But it's saying it's a liminal complex technique. It's not a pure complex technique, and that's I think has more value. And also it looks more like a flow diagram. The other reason I'm pleased is people tended to use Cynefin as a static categorization technique. The liminal version, interestingly, graphically, suddenly makes people realize more that it's much more about flow, it's much more about dynamics.
There's some dynamics to go back and forth, and it's not just a categorizing tool for categories. So also in the masterclass, we talked about the fact that your current competence can be your biggest hindrance, so to say, in your complex domain. Could you expand shortly on that?
Yeah, that's Clayton Christensen's point, all right? I mean, if you look at what he says, is that the reason organizations fail is not because they're incompetent, but they're very, very competent in old paradigms, so they don't see change. Now, I've augmented that with apex predator theory, which is a key part of the book. It's a new approach to strategy. And it basically says if you're in a period of high commoditization, then the old paradigm is about to switch. So commoditization is an indication you introduce novelty, because something novel will actually create the new reality. If you're not in that sort of period, then you're into a stabilization thing. And I use the example of the transfer from IBM to Microsoft to Apple, each of which was an apex predator, each of which came left field from nowhere, each of which exploited an existing technology to get early advantage in a new field. And the first two of those didn't see the change coming. And in theory, Apple will be in the same position. And again, that would be an illustration of what we were talking about earlier, is that Agile is now at that top end of the apex predator cycle, over-commoditized, over-structured, therefore non-adaptive when the ecosystem changes.
Isn't it the same that happens also on individual levels? Like for manager, for example, if they have the past success, they think they know how to handle it, and if they had past success in a complicated domain, that's a pitfall for...
It can do, but I think there's a danger of taking systems concepts to individuals. I think in that case, it's not only just that the manager has done that, but the culture in which they're surrounded reinforces it. So it's not just an individual thing. And one of the things I think those of us in a complexity perspective are arguing very strongly is the excessive focus on individual change will actually prevent change. We need to focus on system change. And the way you change a complex adaptive system is not by changing individuals, but by changing the way people connect.
And the interactions.
Yeah, if you change changing interactions is not only easier, it's more ethical. But then by changing interactions, you can radically change what happens.
I remember you said something like, you cannot really change people anyway, so the thing you can change is the connections or interactions. And
people will change in different contexts. So, and you see that people radically change based on who they're with and what's gone on before. So in complexity, context is everything, right? And by changing the context, people change and flow with a context shift. Trying to change systems by changing people, it just takes too long.
You work a lot with large group interventions as well, I understand. That's also a way then to work with the system rather than individuals.
And I mean, it's interesting. I'm doing a session with Harrison from Open Space in January. Right? I think Open Space is a very valuable technique if it's practiced. Right? I don't think Agile practices it well, because they reduce what should be an open space over 1 or 2 days into a series of half-hour sprints at a conference, and that's not really open space, right? We do a large group, but in a large group, people don't volunteer for things. They're forced to interact with people they don't want to interact with, because we want to increase what's scanned, right? So if you're doing strategy work, you need something in which people are inherently uncomfortable. If you're trying to build consensus, you want something like open space where people feel more comfortable. So it's a horses for courses, to use a British phrase. I think it's one of the other big problems with Agile is people get they conflate a method with an ideology. And then anything which isn't that method is condemned. They don't realise that methods are all contextual. Yeah, it's not Scrum or Kanban, all right? They both work in different contexts in different places, all right?
But
it's not open space is everything. Open space is a method. It works in some context. It's not an ideology.
Yeah, so it tends to be either or thinking.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it's kind of like the religious wars in Agile are quite entertaining, really, if you know anything about medieval history, right? And I'm waiting for bonfires to be erected in squares and for representatives of the Agile community to be dragged out kicking and streaming by the Agile Curia.
So there are value in all methods, but different contexts.
Yeah, it's multiple methods. I mean, that's my big problem with things like SAFe, which I think has betrayed a lot of the spirit of Agile. In it is not mixed methods; it's an assimilation of all methods into an engineering construct.
In the masterclass, you mentioned a lot of other projects you're involved in, so we didn't really talk only about Agile, but there were some really interesting, maybe more important topics than Agile. Could you mention a few other projects?
Yeah, one of the big ones, certainly, if I look at the main ones within the Cynefin Centre, right? We're working on citizen engagement at the moment, in which we're getting kids at the age of 16 or 17, community activists, sports clubs, to actually act as ethnographers to their own communities, on a continuous basis. That's initially funded by the Welsh Government. It's going across the Welsh Valleys. We're talking in Finland at the moment. I'm talking in Sweden later on today about the possibility of it coming here. And the concept there is to produce a human system to buffer the echo chamber effect of social media. So by increasing human agency in the system, and it's also, we're sort of seeing the present and the past through the eyes of the future. I mean, in Wales, we have a thing called the Future Generations Act, which requires all legislation to explicitly deal with how it will impact on the future generation.
Oh, that's good.
And that's unique to Wales, all right? And the Commissioner, Sophie, is responsible for enforcing it. Now, we're building into that in the citizen engagement programme. So we're seeing communities through the eyes of the future. But then we're doing cross-generational coupling, in which young people bring in people from their grandparents' generation working in their community to work with the software to come up with interventions which will make a difference. And that, to my mind, is really exciting, all right? And that's a worldwide project shortly.
So how it will work? Will it be the actual interactions that you are kind of
it's raw narrative, all right? So, for example, our starting point in any school, all right, and this is kind of like the same school year every year, so it's proper sampling, is the kids basically are trained how to do the ethnography. And they go and find somebody in their grandparents and their parents' generation and ask for them for the story that person thinks the child should remember. That's core cultural mapping. Then next month it might be go and find somebody who lives on their own and interview them about their lives. So rather than have to commission market research, we got that continuous flow. But as I say, the kids can sit down in their community and say, what can we do tomorrow to create more stories like this, fewer stories like that? And we also capture the interventions. So this is about empowering communities, to engage in their own future.
I think this is super interesting. So that's really important work. So where are you off to now after this masterclass here?
Berlin for the next couple of days, and then from there on to Saskatoon. So I think it's -30 there at the moment for 3 days before I go down to Vancouver, then back to Berlin, and then out to Tallinn, and then I get some time off for Christmas.
Yeah, and then you're off writing, you said as well.
Yeah, I've got 8 days in a remote Welsh cottage with views of the sea and no internet access, but a good pub. So the idea is I write the book.
Good. We'll look forward to the book, and thanks for taking time to come to CRISP in your busy schedule, and I hope to see you back maybe next year. Thank you.
Cheers.